Wow, okay, huge turnout here. That's fantastic. Look, I really appreciate everybody turning up this afternoon, considering all the pretty amazing sessions that seem to be going on. This is the Symfony Components Travel Guide session, so if you're misplaced, this is the time to escape. Otherwise, I think the doors will be locked in a few moments. So you're stuck with me. My name's Piers Warmers. I'm not a Drupal developer, so you probably don't know me, and I'm really excited to be here to meet everybody maybe after the session's over. But I've been working in PHP for a long time now, more than 10 years, and I've also been working with Symfony right back from when it was in its early alpha stages, and predominantly now I work on Symfony-based projects. So before I get started onto the real core of the topic today, I thought it's probably better to give a little bit of context as to why we're probably all here and interested in how Symfony and Drupal are getting together. So to take a little bit of a step back in time, back to 1996, which was pretty awesome, and when PHP gets its first release, and it's great, the community loves it. For the first time, we can embed simple script into our HTML documents, and that's pretty exciting stuff. But it's a powerful tool, as we know PHP is, and it also gave us a few problems. And we were bad. We did naughty things with our PHP. And I'm probably not alone saying that I have been guilty of things like this back in the day. And yeah, not particularly pretty. The PHP community grew really strongly, and there was a strong open source ethos that developed in the community. And while there were a lot of projects blossoming all over the place and a lot of really cool applications like Drupal and PHP-BB, these communities were grabbing code around the place, and so were the developers, but not to pull any punches. By my sort of perspective, sharing in PHP really was about copying and pasting. And that's not the greatest way to share code. Now, there were things to help us make it a little bit prettier, I know, but I don't know how many people here have actually set up a pair channel. Right, so it's a good example. For a community that's really heavily focused on open source and sharing code, the fact that one of the predominant sharing mechanisms isn't really used by many people at all. And that's a big problem. So by my thinking, Pair really is facing a few problems, and it's not a great way forward. But in 2009, something changed. Now, PHP had a whole lot of object-oriented support already, but it was getting pretty savvy in the way it was delivering features to us. And there were a few features delivered in the PHP 5.3 release. A couple that we'll be talking about today, or one in particular, is namespaces, which really presented a few good opportunities for the PHP community to clean its act up a little bit and get serious about sharing code and writing clean code. And shortly after PHP 5.3 was released, the Framework Interoperability Group put together a couple of recommendations. And they were the PSR 0, 1, 2, and 3. Has everybody heard of these? Is anybody working sort of towards those standards? That's fantastic. Look, it's probably worthwhile then. I'm glad that there's not many people that really have had much to do with it, so I'll go through a couple of slides just to give you a very quick run through what it was all about. So PSR 0 came forward and made recommendations about how we name classes and how we use namespaces. And then in turn, make sure that we put those classes in a directory structure which is succinct with the class name and namespace. So nothing too exciting there, but it's a good thing to do when you're trying to keep code clean. The PSR 1 was about getting a little bit more standardized in the way we name things. So we started getting directions on how classes should be named, how constants should be named, how properties should be named, and also how functions should be named. Nothing too special there either, but it was really big to see the community actually working towards a single target, and that was conforming code. PSR 2 got a little bit more extended on that basic premise and told us that we really must be using namespaces from now on. This is important stuff. And we really need to be using use statements to declare what classes rely on. We're told a little bit more about how we should indent our braces. That's the most important thing in coding, of course. I'm a bit of an obsessive compulsive, so things like that really disturb me when I'm writing code. And over the years, I kind of switched between different styles, and I'm just glad someone's telling me how to do it now. So it actually makes sense to me. We also had to declare how the visibility worked for our methods and properties in classes. Another good cleaning tip there. And so things were getting pretty organized in the PHP community. Okay, I'll leave it there for a second, and I'll jump on to one of the main topics today, and that is, what is Symfony? So Symfony is a little bit hard to describe in some ways. I think particularly because it started like a regular PHP framework back in the day. So Symfony version 1 was like many frameworks out there, a big blob of code that sat there. And when version 2 came along, it got a little bit more complicated in some ways. So Symfony is these things. So first of all, it's a collection of object-oriented PHP 5.3, of course, classes. They all conform to the PSR recommendations put forward. And the classes are all grouped into components. So this is kind of interesting. So the components themselves are just simply libraries that are organized in a way where they're reduced into their core functions. So Symfony Framework, how does this differ? So Symfony Framework is really just these components put together into a context. So it's an implementation of Symfony components. And this implies something quite interesting. And I'll refer to a quote here, which I think is pretty concise and illustrates things really well. So Symfony is decoupled components that are put together in a context to solve common web problems. And that's exactly what's happening with Drupal. So what are these components? Well, there's a big list here. If we run down the list, you'll probably recognize a few little pieces that pop out. And as we said before, they're there to solve common web development problems. Things like working with HTTP, routing, security, configuration management, working with forms and form validation. There's also some very cool components in there for translation with I18N and also L10N handling. So all these things kind of put together and are built into a distribution which is Symfony Framework, but they're not required. You're not required to actually use Symfony Framework to get the benefit out of any of these components. They're all decoupled. So decoupled components. To put it simply, these components can be moved around as you need them. So you can cherry pick the ones that are appropriate for your project. This has been the core move for the Symfony 2 framework. Now, this is even different to the Symfony 1 framework, which, as I said, was much more of a standard PHP application, a big blob of code. But in 2, everything changed. Symfony's core focus was to make these components as decoupled as possible. But this actually causes a couple of pretty interesting questions for this, the PHP community. What about cross-dependencies? If you take a PHP library out to its most reduced minimal function, there's always going to be the case where it requires some other library. And that's a really complicated problem when you start thinking about it. So one component requires another. It also requires a specific version. 2 components that are interlinked together may also share a dependency of a single library. So now we start seeing a pretty complex map of dependencies here, and that needed to be solved. So there's also been another new community that's been popping up recently, and that's the Composer utility. Has everybody here heard of Composer? Okay, so that's great. So Composer is simply a dependency management utility, and it knits a couple of things like PSR0, which defines how packages or components be structured, along with some versioning specifications to make sure they can be mapped into a release cycle. And it maps all these things together and allows you to with much greater ease, include a component into your project. Now, Composer also is often talked about in relation to Packagist. So Packagist is a directory of thousands and thousands of packages, which is a lookup service for Composer. By the way, if you're not wanting your code open source, there's also a SATA server there that you can take a look at if you want to work within the bounds of a company. It's definitely worth checking out. So the Composer and Packagist work together to map dependencies, and they do this with a simple configuration system. It's a composer.json file, and each component in a system has one of these, and in turn it maps its own dependencies inside that file. We'll take a look at that in a second. There's another part to Composer, which is a composer.far file. This is actually the command line utility that you run to install the packages on your system. If you're familiar with Drush, it's a similar sort of idea where you download a package and that provides some command line tools for installing these packages. And the final part to Composer, which is really quite interesting, is a lock file. So for whenever you're working with teams and you've got a system which requires, one system requires another, it can get quite complicated when you have that call from a fellow developer saying, it's broken on my system. And a lot of the times that can be nutted down to a version conflict where you can't guarantee that everybody's working off the same versions because they're working on different systems. Pair was really notorious for this, where you would install a library via pair, it would work for one person, it would break for another. So Composer is really good at this. It supplies a composer.lock file, which you can actually send to your Git repository or your versioning system and then distribute out across a team. And that way you know that everybody in the team is running off exactly the same version. Pretty cool feature. So how does this look back in our dependency maps? Well, every node, as we said, has a composer.json file. In that file, it will then in turn map out what it requires and what versions. Those files, look, I've taken an example here. This is kind of interesting because this is actually off the Drupal.org site. I found this Drupal Git library, and the developers here are also defining a requirement. And I'll just jump up here. A requirement here, which is a project outside of Drupal, being dragged in. It's the Gitter library. And in this case, this module is marking it as a dependency. So that's quite interesting. So what are the next steps if we were trying to do something like this with a composer.json file? Well, we'd have to flip back to the terminal. And as we looked at before, there's also a command line utility. And it's packaged into a FAR file. For those of you who aren't familiar with FAR files, it's an archiving system for PHP. And you can embed a micro application in there. There's also a pain in the neck sometimes to get working on your system because there's a lot of system dependent nuances with it. So there's an installer from getcomposer.org, and this first line here is simply grabbing the installer, and then it in turn will build you a composer.far file on your system, making sure you don't get any errors in the process. And once you've got that, you can actually run it with an install command, and it'll run off to the web and drag in the dependencies. In this case, there's two dependencies which have been dragged in. The first there is a Symfony process component. Now that wasn't actually marked over in this composer.json file on the left because it's actually a dependency of the Gitter library, not the Drupal Git module. So Composer has worked out the dependency there and dragged in that other library as well. Now the libraries are packed into a vendor directory. And inside the vendor directory is also a very handy utility, which is an autoload script, which allows you to include classes in your code without worrying about where their location is. So at the top of your code, you could simply write something like that, and you have access to all the libraries you're wanting. So I don't know. I'm probably not. I don't project, I think, my excitement about this very well. I don't know how crazy I'm looking up here, but this stuff is really, really cool. I think it's really important to just reflect on how complex that scenario is and how easily Composer can sort of act as a bridge between including all these libraries and getting them into your code, and then moving forward also maintaining versions and doing updates. So that's fantastic. You get over, I think, so this number was actually taken last night. So on the Packagist site, there's over 7,200 libraries at your disposal there. And that's not to say you have to use Packagist either. You can actually drag libraries in via Composer from their versioning sources as well. So that's a huge number and definitely an interesting directory to go and take a look at. It's simple. It really is simple once you get your head around it. It provides you with an end-to-end way to package your own code and also then grab other people's code into your project in a neat and elegant way. So I'm really surprised at how this has changed my developing cycle now. When I start a new project, I think the first thing I do is really sit down with the Composer file and I go and search for what's already out there. Because it's easy. I can go and get really good code. I can see code along with its history and see who else is using it. And then I can say I can build a shopping list essentially for my project. And I think this is a really good way to break the not invented here cycle, which for so often really in the PHP world I think was very predominant. Go to another source like SourceForge or to GitHub and take a copy and paste of somebody else's code. And it's not the neatest way you can do things. So this is a really important feature. Finally, this is removing the barriers to getting your code out there. It's really simple to work with packages. So if you're writing a library, it doesn't have not many boundaries at all, really, to get your library back out into the community. And I think, well, I know that Drupal is very focused on sharing code, and the PHP community in general would really benefit from seeing the Drupal developers throwing bits and pieces out of Drupal modules back into the greater PHP community. And this sort of tool is a great way to allow you to do that. So what it's doing to the PHP community in general? Well, I think it's taking a whole lot of really big systems that are out there at the moment, Drupal being one of them, and forcing them to take a little bit of a look at their own code and identify common logic. Because there's no real reason why you should be writing pretty boring parts of the code or code that can be better handled on a community level in general. Rather, what you want to be doing is taking that repeated logic, identifying a likely source which can take control of it, and then moving into your own projects. So this is another number I took off the packages website. So over 10 million installs since April last year. That's a pretty amazing number. It's a new project and it's growing really, really fast. So I would expect that in the next 12 months we'd see a far bigger number. So that's packages, Composer, and a little bit of an introduction to Symfony. The next step here, I think, is taking a look at some code in action. And I've taken a few examples which aren't entirely random. The first one here is to look at a very simple request coming through in PHP. There's some good reasons why you don't want to handle this with the old-fashioned procedural PHP code. It can be more complex than it first looks. And in this case here, we're going to use a composer.json file, and this is actually the entire file, and as complicated as it needs to be right now. We're taking in a dependency, which is a Symfony component, the HTTP foundation, and inside that component has some classes for handling request objects. Once it's installed, we can simply get access to that code by including the autoload, which will drag in the classes that we need. And when we use the class, it's at our disposal already. We can instantiate it, and then we can use it to get a variable back from the getParameter property. Not a really complicated example, but it illustrates how simple it is to actually include a complicated library, a library which is really has a lot of function for handling requests in HTTP, and getting it into your code is really, really simple. I'll show another example here, which is, of course, the next step. This is the response. Again, we're using HTTP Foundation, of course, request and response toolkits in the same component. Again, we look at the auto load and a use statement. But further down there, we see the response is being built. And that's actually, I think, a really interesting example there, because we can see that the sending the response back to the browser along with the status code and also a TTL, and by no means are these comprehensive in the example. There's a lot more handling of the HTTP response available in that class. But this gives you an example of how quickly a very neatly handled response can be made by using this component. So the next example here is a little bit more complex. It's actually talking about routing, and there's another component which is being included in this composer.json file, and it's the routing component. It allows you to create a route collection, and via simple handles, in this case the say handle, define a routing rule along with default property values. Fantastic. I don't know if anybody's actually worked with routing logic before. It can actually be quite complicated. And by using a utility like this, you're outsourcing all of that complexity to the composer, the component. and then to use it. Now, this is probably not the best example here. We go through some setup pieces. We go back to our good old response object. And now it gets quite interesting. We can actually put the route collection to task and see if we have a match. Now, in this case, if we do have a match, we can set some content into the response, fairly standard process. But one interesting little detail to note here is the neat way failed route matches are handled. That's in the next section here. So we can actually catch them. Because it's all object-oriented, we have a neatly thrown exception and therefore the opportunity to catch these and provide appropriate responses. In one case, it's for a method not allowed, so we may be looking for a route that is only matchable via a get call rather than a post. And if the wrong type of call is found, we can throw an exception for that. And the second case there, of course, the old 404 error. I'll move away from Symfony components for a second and give an example here of Twig templating engine, which I know is quite a controversial topic in the Drupal community at the moment. I'll reflect on some of those details later in the presentation. But to start off with, just to give you a very simple example of how we can actually include Twig into a simple piece of code. Again, we're using composer.json to define the requirement of the Twig library. And digging into a little bit of code here, we can see that the response object can be decorated, or at least the content can be placed in via the Twig templating engine. In the first part here, we're defining an actual template file, which is relatively simple. And we're also providing a message to send through as a property into that template. So, look, it's a very, very simple example here, but I think it illustrates how easy it is to include some of these libraries, particularly when they've been developed with modularity or decoupling in mind. Okay, final example to go on with. This is actually an interesting one because it's part of a monologue library, which is a PSR3 compliant library. PSR3 really outlines a logging sort of set of standards, and monologue conforms to those. It's a great library if you haven't used it before and you have any sort of logging requirements. Of course, getting it started is really, really simple. Once you've instantiated your object on the constructor, you can actually say where your where your log file is located, and also define the log level. And then, of course, throwing log messages into that file is simple. There's a little example down there of what that actually looks like in the file. So that's just a couple of examples to illustrate how components can be dragged into your code. I hope they've given a little bit of an illustration of how simple the process is, particularly when you start with the composer file. Composer.json files aren't very complex. In fact, at their most basic, they can be ridiculously simple. And dragging those libraries into your code and getting started with it on a functional level can take seconds. Okay, so I'll move on to the next part of the talk, which is Drupal and Symfony. Really what we're here to hear about. And Symfony, as we saw before, is a big set of components. And Drupal is definitely making use of some of these components, not all of them. So Drupal is making use of the following components as of a very recent scan through the Drupal 8 code that I conducted a short time ago. It is changing from time to time, so if this is slightly outdated, apologies for that. I also noted that there was some conversation on the Drupal.org site about the event dispatcher, which I think is now being moved back to Drupal 9, but I'm not entirely sure if that's still the case. But you can see the components that are being used here, a few of them will actually be familiar from our examples, like the HTTP foundation, the routing. Actually, in this example here, those two are the ones we use in the examples. To give you an idea about what the others are used for, well, there's a class loading utility there, which is a sort of an extended library for handling classes and the auto loading, which we saw Composer doing. Symfony provides some tools around that as well. There's also a dependency injection library being included. Has everybody used dependency injection? A few people? I guess I'm pretty sure actually all of you are doing it but just don't know you are. So dependency injection is simply a pattern where you take commonly accessed libraries or utility classes around your application, ones that you load all the time, and basically say, instantiate this for me. And that's simply what dependency injection is about. And the instantiation process is handled by a service, and therefore you can ask the service to give you a complex object back again without having to go through the configuration of that object when you're retrieving it. It's really handy if you're working in different separated environments like development to production, where you can actually instantiate objects using configuration variables. HTTP Foundation, HTTP kernel. We saw the HTTP Foundation being used previously in the examples. It provides utilities like requests and response. The HTTP kernel is a little bit more of a wrapping utility which can take control of more complicated logic like matching routes back to some sort of logic, business logic behind the scenes, and also then handling responses, requests and responses to knit all that together. There's a routing component. We saw the usage of that as well. There's a YAML component being included. I think that in Drupal 8, you're moving to a YAML-based configuration system. Is that still the case? Does anybody know that for sure? I think it is still the case. And YAML is another sort of a serialized format to store or persist configuration. And there's also a library to help with the serialization, deserialization of configuration being included as well. But just to reflect a little bit, just remember that the inclusion of components into Drupal 8 isn't limited to Symfony. In fact, there's a number of these components being included, and I'll go through those with you now. Doctrine is a fantastic library which is, works around database support. So there's database abstraction layer and also object relational mapping. It's a really fantastic library. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's definitely worth checking out, and it's being included in Drupal 8. The Guzzle toolkit is there for consuming RESTful services. There's also an Easy RDF library, which is also another great way to handle RDF documents. And there's also the Symfony CMF routing component. Now, this one's actually quite interesting because I doubt whether you've heard of this. Symfony has its own small CMS project going on. It's Symfony CMF. And it's also building its architecture on a decoupled model. So bits and pieces of the Symfony CMF can be taken out and used in other CMSs. And that's a pretty cool thing when you think about it. So we've got one CMS group having some of its libraries elegantly shared into another CMS group. And I think, you know, just to have a bit of a shoot through to the future, wouldn't it be great one day if we saw in the Symfony CMF, in its composer.json file, a requirement Drupal page component. I think that'd be a really great thing to see in the future, and I think the Symfony community have a little bit of an aspiration that, you know, one day we'll be dragging bits of Drupal out elegantly by Composer and using them all around the place. So just an interesting little part there. Plus there's a couple of very, very interesting ones. There's also Chris Wallsmith's aesthetic library. If you haven't used it, it's fantastic. It's a filtering system where you can apply a range of compilation filters to things like CSS files. So you can take less and Sass code and then convert it back into CSS, and also compress it and minify it into a single file or just many compressed versions of the files you've got. So it's fantastic for CSS. It's also fantastic for working with JavaScript. It'll provide a range of compilers and compressors for your JavaScript files. And finally, it's also fantastic for working with images and optimizing them for their final presentation on the web. There's another really great library, and we've already touched on this earlier. It's Twig, the very ominous Twig. And this is actually the logo of Twig, if you haven't seen it before. Note the cold, dead eyes. No, Twig's not very frightening. Twig is awesome, in fact, and there's some good reasons why I think it's awesome. Twig is really fast. So for a templating language, it compiles back into PHP, not just PHP, but optimized PHP, meaning it runs very, very fast, and you don't have the overhead that you might attribute to some other templating languages. it's concise. So I look at PHP embedded in templates, and I know what's going on, but I know that designers look at it and fear the little PHP tags because they're horrible and they complicate templates. So I think Twig is really great because it makes the templates very concise by removing a lot of the logic out of them. It's secure, really secure. So output is escape by default with Twig, meaning you don't, well, it's one more barrier for a cross-site scripting attack to get to its target. All the output is escaped, so you don't have to worry if user-generated content is being put into your templates. It's a little bit of a reassurance to know that it's being escaped by default. It's also sandboxed, so this is really important if you're moving template development to another group which you may not know particularly well, or just in general you want to have templates coming back into your project knowing that there's been no sneaky additions to the templates, no PHP tags which are either going to be a security risk, a proper security risk, or just a performance risk to your website operating in a healthy way. So it's fantastic with a sandbox. The other thing it really forces you to do, there's also extendable, so you can actually write custom extensions to it, filters and tags, another useful thing for when you're building websites. And finally, it's really good for making sure your business logic stays where it should be, and that's in the business side of things, and your presentation logic is kept in the templates. So it's a really good utility for making sure you adhere to separation of concerns. Okay, so that's Twig. By the way, there is a Twig panel tomorrow. I think this time is correct. Definitely check your schedules, but should be interesting at the very least. Looks like there's going to be a lot of opportunity to ask questions about it. So the big question, I guess, for Drupal and this big change in Drupal 8, why oh why? Well, Drupal is always improving with every major release. It's moving forward, and I think the Drupal core team are pushing this idea of improving the architecture, making sure that it's at its most elegant and up-to-date as it can be. This is going to require a little bit of effort, not just from the core team, but everybody involved. It's an upgrade, and there's changes are going to be part of that, but I hope that through the course of this discussion, I've quelled any sort of anxieties that might be floating around what components are and how complicated they might be. And of course, the reason why you're really doing this is there's huge gains to be made. So the gains, well, you're going to be moving towards a more standardized architecture, and that's really, really important. Why is that really important? Well, it's not just about improving the code, it's also making sure that new people coming into Drupal are provided with a familiar interface for when they're working with your code. So I'm a PHP developer. I've been working with PHP for a long time, but I would not say that I'm a Drupal developer. And it's kind of a funny place to be in, considering that it should be far easier for somebody out of the Drupal community to come in. And I think moving towards a more standard architecture will really improve that position. It's also going to free up a lot of time for the Drupal core team. They don't have to worry about every single function of the CMS, say for instance routing complexities or HTTP kernels. If they're outsourcing some of this to the broader community, it's a big win for Drupal as well. They get to focus on things like building better features into the core delivery, which is a CMS. That's a big win, I think. It also allows for better integration. So I touched on this earlier. So integration from external projects back into Drupal, and then also in the future possibly taking decoupled pieces of Drupal code back into the community. And I think that's a really exciting prospect for everybody. Finally, I'll just show you a little quote here, which I think is pretty cool. It's from a computer scientist. I pronounce his name terribly, so if there's any people that know how to pronounce it better, I'm sorry. Edsger Ditzker said that one of the most important things for when you're working with technology is how it influences your behavior. And I think it's a really profound statement to when you think about it. What you want when you're using technologies like Drupal is to make sure the users are subtly and behind the scenes influenced and improved as they work with the technology itself. And I think that's a great thing to bear in mind. And finally, just before I wrap this up, look, there's some homework. If you are interested, if I've sparked any interest today, I've put together a little bit of code. This will be available online as well. There's some links down the bottom if you are interested. But what this will do is take a little GIS that I've put together. It's not exactly succinct with the examples I showed you earlier, but it's pretty close and actually enhances a few of them, like the twig templating. So definitely check that out. It may need a little bit of tweaking depending on your own personal system, but once you run that, you'll be able to get an amazing example shown to you. So yeah, definitely check it out. Just before I really do finish, some things you might want to have a bit of a discussion about internally. I thought these were interesting topics. So there's Drush support for Composer already. It is, as far as I'm aware, it's a wrapper for Composer functions, and will also provide some installation hooks for modules that use Composer as well. Now, please don't take my word for it. There's probably a discussion for yourselves. There's also an interesting discussion on the Drupal.org website that I saw, which was for moving the vendor directory from core back down to the root level. And this is really an interesting discussion. Having the vendor directory inside Drupal core is not particularly normal for external developers. Typically, we would expect coming into a project which has Composer being used that there be a single vendor directory, and therefore if two different, say a module has a requirement of a particular dependency that Drupal also shares, they're both running out of a single vendor system. At the moment, some of the modules that are using Composer actually have their own vendor directory inside the module. So this is a little bit of an interesting sort of situation, and there's a good discussion going on about it, I believe. Okay, finally, why not make Drupal core a component and also a dependency for Drupal CMS, so that a Drupal distribution would have a Composer file and then also mark as its primary dependency Composer core. That'd be really, really cool, by the way. So if you ever decide to rant at a Drupal core developer, I'd suggest this might be a good conversation to strike up, but possibly an irritating one if they've heard it before. So, and the final thing is start playing. Like, it's really simple to get your code back out in the community using Composer. And also, if you bear in mind you write code with a decoupled sort of philosophy behind it, it's going to be a win for everybody. You're going to be feeding back into the greater PHP community and also developing really cool, well-engineered code for Drupal itself. And that's it. I've been instructed to also say you should go to the website, the DrupalCon website, and provide some feedback from my discussion today. Any feedback is welcome, good or bad, so please do. And look, there's some time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, now's your opportunity. Yes? Of course. That might be... Let me see what I can do. Apparently not. Oh, the slides are also available on the website as well, so should you want to take a copy of them.
That's the most recent list you made, is it?
That is very recent, yes. I think down to about 20 minutes before this started. So, sorry, down the back.
So in a typical Symfony project, you only have one composer file, right? So you don't find each kind of component or module has its own composer and define.
They all have a Composer file, but they all load their dependencies into a single vendor directory. So it's a great question. So yes, there are many Composer.json files. Each decoupled component will hold its own, but when Composer runs, it will then in turn load all those dependencies into a single vendor directory. There's one root Composer file, and that's the project dependency sort of mapping. So when you start your project on the very root level, you'll have your own Composer file. The examples that I gave earlier were examples of just such a file. Yep. Yeah, go. Oh, cool. Okay. Okay. A git clone to, yes, there is. Yes, you can actually provide, say, take an entire local clone as well. So yes, you can do that.
If you update the composer file, is it possible just to fast forward any git clones to reach a newer version of the package?
You would map that, I believe, in the composer version. So you would say you could move to a dev branch if that's what you mean by that question, I think.
Well, just if the composer file was updated to a later version, then that would be a later commit in Git. So if you had a Git checkout, could it just fast forward to there?
I'm not sure. Look, I don't know. But it's a great question. And does anybody else have an answer to that? No. It's a fantastic question. I can definitely look it up for you and get back to you. Talk to me later and yeah, get your details. Any other questions? Yep.
I know you're not a Drupal developer, but obviously there's going to be a little bit of conflict in between Symfony and Drupal, say DDCG and Doctrine and the Form API versus Symfony's own. Do you have any idea what the direction is there?
Look, I think some of the decisions made behind what components are being dragged in were based pretty much on what you say. I believe in the very early days there was some discussion about including the form components, but there were complexities, and Drupal's a big system; it's complicated. So there's going to be elements that will have to be sort of mapped in piece by piece, or it may never be mapped in at all. Drupal may decide that in the end it should just stick with its own form component, maybe eventually even adding that back into the community as well as an independent component of Drupal. So yeah, there's definitely complexities. And just running through the presentation and taking a look at the cycles of Drupal's 8's development, you can definitely see where decisions have been made, and there's complexities all along the way to sort of integrating that. But they're doing a great job as far as I can see. Yep. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Is there like a Twig binary that is written in C?
Yeah, there is actually. I think there's a PHP extension now for Twig. So yeah, I think definitely. I haven't actually installed it on my system, so but it should speed things up a little bit. Yeah. Yep. Okay. All right. Well, look, I'll hang around here should anybody want to have a bit of a chat about anything. And look, thanks so much for turning up today. I really appreciate it. It was great to see you all. Thank you.